The year is 1920. World War I is over, and America is celebrating by having a nationwide panic attack known as the First Red Scare. Everyone is terrified of immigrants, anarchists, and basically anyone with a hard-to-pronounce last name and an opinion. Into this wonderfully tolerant atmosphere step Nicola Sacco, a skilled shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fish peddler who reads philosophy. Both are Italian immigrants. Both are avowed anarchists who believe in a world without governments, which, to be fair, is a bold career choice in early 20th century America. They were advocates for the working class, draft dodgers during the war, and generally the kind of people who made men in top hats very, very nervous. Their political activities had already put them on the government's watch list. They just didn't know how short that list was about to get. On April 15, 1920, in the quiet town of Braintree, Massachusetts, a shoe company paymaster and his guard were walking down the street with a payroll of over $15,000. Suddenly, two men shot them dead in broad daylight, grabbed the cash boxes, and jumped into a waiting getaway car with several other accomplices. It was a brutal, efficient, and professional job. The kind of heist you'd expect from a seasoned criminal gang, not a shoemaker and a fishmonger. The police, under immense pressure to solve the case, started looking for suspects. Their initial search criteria were broad. They were looking for Italians. Specifically, some of those anarchist bastards, according to the local police chief. A truly brilliant piece of detective work, focusing on political ideology rather than, actual evidence. So, how did Sacco and Vanzetti get roped into this? They weren't picked up for the robbery. Oh no, that would be too logical. They were arrested on a streetcar on May 5th because they were trying to retrieve a car that police suspected was used by anarchists to hide radical literature. The police chief's plan was simple: arrest them on suspicion of being radicals and see what sticks. When arrested, both men were carrying guns. This was common for the time, but for two Italians with unpopular political views, it was practically a confession. They also lied during their initial questioning, claiming they didn't know certain anarchist comrades. Why lie? Because they were trying to protect their friends from deportation during the Palmer raids, a government-sponsored hobby of rounding up and kicking out radicals. Their lies, intended to shield others, were immediately interpreted by the prosecution as consciousness of guilt for a murder they hadn't even been charged with yet. Perfect! The trial began in May 1921, and the prosecution's case rested heavily on eyewitnesses. It was a parade of uncertainty and contradiction that would be hilarious if people's lives weren't on the line. One witness, Mary Splain, identified Sacco because she noticed his good-looking left hand for a fleeting second from a window 60 feet away as the getaway car sped by at 18 miles per hour. She initially couldn't identify him, but had a miraculous memory jog a year later. Another witness claimed he recognized Sacco from a moving train. Multiple witnesses for the defense, mostly fellow Italians, provided Sacco and Vanzetti with alibis. Sacco was in Boston getting a passport. Vanzetti was selling fish. But their testimony was dismissed. One was told he couldn't be trusted because he was a dago. At least 17 eyewitnesses either identified other men or said definitively that Sacco and Vanzetti were not the gunmen. Their testimony was largely ignored. The prosecution's star witnesses, however, were treated as gospel, despite their ever-changing stories. It seems in 1920s Massachusetts, your credibility depended heavily on your accent. If the witnesses were a mess, the forensic evidence was a masterpiece of motivated reasoning. The prosecution claimed that a single bullet, bullet 3, was fired from Sacco's Colt pistol. Two firearms experts for the prosecution testified that it was consistent with being fired from Sacco's gun, a phrase that means very little. Two experts for the defense testified that it absolutely was not. So, a tie. Except not really. Years later, it was discovered that one of the prosecution's experts, Captain William Proctor, told the prosecutor before the trial that he didn't believe the bullet came from Sacco's gun. He was then coached to use the ambiguous, consistent with phrasing. Then there was Vanzetti's revolver. The prosecution argued it belonged to the murdered guard, Berardelli. The problem? Berardelli had dropped his gun off for repair weeks before the murder, and there was no record of him ever getting it back. But why let a pesky detail like a repair receipt get in the way of a good story? Presiding over this circus was Judge Webster Thayer. Let's just say he wasn't a fan of impartiality. Thayer was a man who saw anarchists in his soup and openly despised Sacco and Vanzetti's politics. During the trial, he made his opinions known. To reporters, he referred to the defendants as those anarchist bastards. At his golf club, he was overheard bragging to fellow blue bloods that he would get them good and proper. All of his rulings from the bench seemed to favor the prosecution, consistently blocking defense motions and allowing the prosecutor to go on long, prejudicial tirades about radicalism. Thayer believed it was his patriotic duty to convict these men to stop the spread of radical ideas. The actual crime was, at best, a secondary concern. The prosecutor, Frederick Katzman, knew he had a weak case on the facts, so he did what any good lawyer would do: he put their beliefs on trial instead. His cross-examination of Sacco was less about the robbery and more about political philosophy. He grilled Sacco on his love for America, his reasons for dodging the draft in World War I, and the books he read. And in order to show your love for this United States of America, when she was about to call upon you to become a soldier, you ran away to Mexico? That was a real question. The jury, composed of native-born, Protestant, middle-class citizens, ate it up. They were being told that these men were not just accused murderers, but disloyal, godless radicals who hated the country. Katzman successfully turned the courtroom into a loyalty test, and it was a test Sacco and Vanzetti were guaranteed to fail. On July 14, 1921, the jury found both men guilty of murder in the first degree. The trial had been a farce, but the appeals process was an object lesson in how a justice system can refuse to admit a mistake. Over the next 6 years, the defense filed motion after motion. They presented new evidence, including the confession of a career criminal named Celestino Medeiros. Medeiros, already sentenced to death for another murder, confessed he was part of the gang that committed the Braintree robbery and swore Sacco and Vanzetti weren't involved. It was a bombshell. So what happened? Every single appeal and motion for a new trial landed on the desk of one man, Judge Webster Thayer. He got to rule on whether his own conduct during the original trial was biased. Shocker, he decided he had been perfectly fair. A special committee appointed by the governor, the Lowell Committee, also reviewed the case and, despite the mountains of doubt, upheld the verdict. The establishment had circled the wagons. Admitting error was simply not an option. While the Massachusetts legal system was patting itself on the back, the rest of the world was horrified. The Sacco and Vanzetti case became an international cause célèbre. Massive protests erupted in cities across the globe: London, Paris, Mexico City, Buenos Aires. American embassies were bombed. People who couldn't care less about anarchism saw the case for what it was: a grotesque miscarriage of justice fueled by prejudice. Famous figures like Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, and George Bernard Shaw wrote letters and petitions demanding a new trial. In America, the intellectual and artistic communities were galvanized. Edna St. Vincent Millay and Dorothy Parker were arrested protesting outside the Boston State House. But the pressure had the opposite effect on the authorities. It hardened their resolve, framing the executions as a necessary stand against foreign influence and radical agitation. All appeals were exhausted. Clemency was denied. On August 23, 1927, 7 years after the crime, Nicolas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were sent to the electric chair. Sacco's last words in Italian were "Long live anarchy," followed by "Farewell, my wife and child and all my friends." Vanzetti, ever the eloquent philosopher, spoke to the warden and witnesses before he died. "I wish to tell you that I am innocent and that I have never committed any crime, but sometimes some sin. I am suffering because I am a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian." He finished by saying, "I wish to forgive some people for what they are now doing to me." And with that, the state of Massachusetts executed 2 men whose greatest crime, it seemed, was being in the wrong country, with the wrong politics, at the wrong time. The case never really ended. The guilt or innocence of Sacco and Vanzetti is still debated, though modern analysis of the ballistics evidence remains inconclusive at best and highly suspect at worst. But their actual guilt is almost beside the point. The trial itself was guilty. Guilty of prejudice, of hysteria, and of a complete failure of the judicial process. The system was supposed to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and it failed spectacularly. Instead, the defense was forced to prove their innocence, a task made impossible by a hostile court. It took 50 years, but in 1977, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis issued a formal proclamation. He declared that Sacco and Vanzetti had not been treated justly, and that any stigma and disgrace should be forever removed from their names. It wasn't a pardon that would imply they were guilty. It was an admission that the system itself had been the real criminal. A rather polite, 50-year-late apology for judicial murder. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!